Courage speaks. Courage speaks. Courage speaks.
Welcome to episode 12 of Courage Speaks. I'm your host, Sam Sherman. Courage Speaks is brought to you by Courage to Connect, an outpatient mental health center for therapy, psychological testing, and psychiatry for all ages located in Chicago's North Shore. On today's episode, we have the privilege of diving into the remarkable story of Marissa Kaelter, a beacon of hope and change at Courage to Connect Mental Health Center. As a former school psychologist turned therapist, Marissa unveils her journey from navigating the complexities of an education system she describes as broken to finding her calling with Courage to Connect. Through candid storytelling, Marissa takes us through her experiences in diverse school environments, from inner city schools to the North Shore suburbs, shedding light on the challenges she faced and the transformations she underwent. Amidst the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic, Marissa's decision to pivot her path reveals a tale of resilience and adaptability. Recognizing that her work environment, not the work itself, was the source of stress, she bravely embraced change, offering a beacon of hope for those navigating professional roles amidst global crises. Join us as Marissa shares her insights on setting boundaries, maintaining genuine connections, and the importance of self-care in the midst of a demanding career. Her narrative not only inspires, but also provides invaluable lessons on navigating the complexities of the mental health landscape. This is an episode I know you won't want to miss, a testament to the power of courage, resilience, and the unwavering pursuit of personal well-being. Join us for episode 12 of Courage Speaks with Marissa Kaelter. Marissa Kaelter.
Yes.
Welcome back to Courage Speaks. You were actually one of the first people that I interviewed for the podcast, but that was before we had this fancy studio here in Glenview. So the reason that we're doing this again, other than the fact that even after the first conversation, I really wanted to speak to you again, no matter what, was that the audio was not at a place where we were hoping the great Courage Speaks standard of audio quality would be at. So it's all to say, welcome back to Courage Speaks, but for the listeners, this will be the first time they will hear your voice on the podcast waves.
Yeah, thank you for having me back.
Absolutely.
Here's my voice.
So, how are you today?
I'm okay. Weather's kind of yucky, but I'm feeling good. Spring break, so
yeah,
a little bit of a reprieve.
Yeah, a little bit of a lighter week for you. As many people here at Courage to Connect will be experiencing this week.
Totally.
Yes. So, Marissa, just kind of starting out, can you share with the listeners your background, particularly, in the field of mental health leading up to even your time here at Courage to Connect?
Sure. I went back to school in my 20s for a school psychology degree in New York. And when I moved to Illinois, I worked as a school psychologist for 12 or 13 years. I worked in inner city school. I worked in North Shore suburbs. So I've been in a range of environments. And, somewhere about 2 years ago, I sort of hit my limit on the education system and started to think about what else I wanted to do. And this was, could I do this connecting with people and therapy outside of the school system?
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I sort of ended up at Courage to Connect. And it has been an incredible journey. Incredible.
And how long has it been at Courage? Have you been at Courage?
I joined this team in August, not this past August, but a year ago, whatever year that was.
Okay. 2022?
Yes. So this is going to be...
Yeah. So they were in 24, last August 23. So
Correct.
the one before that.
Correct.
So 22.
It's like,
okay.
A year and a half maybe, or almost
exactly.
2 years.
Yes.
Okay.
So you come from the school psychology background, school settings. I know in our first conversation, you talked about really navigating some of the challenges that came up working in school settings, in a variety of school settings.
Mm-hmm.
For whatever you're comfortable sharing, what did some of those challenges look like? Because as I've spoken to people who have come from school settings, I haven't worked in school settings before. You hear oftentimes, as you well know, a lot of those challenges that seem to pop up. But what did you kind of experience that seemed consistent wherever you'd go?
Systematically, we could not effectively help the kids we needed to help because the system was broken. There were incredible educators. I've worked with some of the most intelligent people at CPS and through my time in the North Shore suburbs. And, some people do what they need to do to survive in the education system. Because most people who go into education are doing it for the children and for their passion and love for connecting and building and learning. And the system is run by people who are not in that mindset. So you've got, changing regulations, district initiatives that shift as quickly as the wind. And you're down on the floor trying to, help a kid whose parents, haven't been home with them for 3 months or hasn't had a meal. And you can't do what you need to do because of red tape.
Right. Makes me think about the hierarchy of needs, right? Where it's like, how can we kind of address, there's certain needs that have to be met, that if those aren't being met, then how can you even move up that or work to, address other things? Was it ever discouraging as far as going into this field, working with people who are very well-intentioned, wanting to help, and basically having decision makers that maybe, I don't want to say they weren't trying to help, but had different things that they had to.
Yeah. 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 My breaking point came after COVID, as I think a lot of people had these aha moments. Long story short, I had the opportunity, I don't know if it was an opportunity, take it or leave it, to stay home over the year of COVID to help homeschool my kids. And with the removal of my career, which I've had, it's part of who I am, all my anxiety just disappeared. And that was sort of my first inkling, like, perhaps I'm in an environment. It's not that I don't like work. I love work. Perhaps I'm in an environment that isn't healthy because no matter how hard you work, you're not, somebody's always angry. And for people who are trying to help and support, and you give all of yourself, and to know that it's just, so you're just crawling to the finish line because you're supporting a lot of people. It's frustrating. What's the word I'm looking for? It feels demeaning a lot of times. Your expertise as an educator, a clinician, is often undermined because there are legal issues at play that nobody can tell you about. Lack of transparency, all those pieces, they wear on you, and you either learn to compartmentalize it, you become super bitter, or you're a wreck all the time.
What was that process like then when you said that you felt like your anxiety kind of lift when you were away from it? Was there a moment in time where did you know that this was a field that you ultimately, even through those challenges, you're like, I want to work in this field, this just doesn't seem the setting? Or was there a period of time where you weren't sure if the mental health field was an area that?
Yeah, for as long as I can remember, my mom was a clinical social worker. I know people. I can remember at a very young age analyzing things with my friends. I have talked my way through many situations. And I would say that without being boastful, I do think that one of my superpowers is being able to sort of connect with people, understanding in a moment, how to, connect with them, to genuinely connect.
Right.
And I have had proof of this over the years through educators helping support teachers, parents. I loved working with parents and students. I didn't love doing therapy in the school setting because you have 20 minutes, maybe, to put a Band-Aid on something.
Right.
And it's rushed and it's, it wasn't meaningful. And so I actually didn't know if I was going to like therapy because I didn't love doing it in the school setting. It felt disingenuous. But through a lot of support and encouragement, I thought, well, you don't know anything until you try it. I did go back to school and worked in the education system one more year after I had this revelation to see if I was able to establish boundaries now that I had a clear perspective.
Right. Yeah.
And I couldn't. It was just sometimes you got a square and you are a round peg. And and you could spend your life trying to fit into the square, or you can just say, I'm going to go find something that's more fulfilling.
Right.
So I actually didn't know if I was going to be happy or successful at this until I started doing it.
The superpower that you describe of being able to kind of have those genuine connections with people, we can see as a clinician, right, how that can show up in your work. I'm curious, as a child or as a teen, or just like when you were younger, the ways that maybe that manifested, or the ways that even you were told that was the case, or you were aware of that. How did that kind of look for a younger Marissa?
Oversensitive. I would say I wore my heart on my sleeve. And I think there was a degree of understanding. I can put myself in somebody's shoes pretty easily, really easily. I can understand, but to a degree, that would allow people to sometimes treat me in a way, or I would take advantage of me because I could understand where they were coming from.
Right.
And so what it looked like was more of me fixing things all the time. As a kid, fixing my friends' problems, fixing, my family's problems. I'm a fixer. And that's sort of how it showed up. Later, it's hard to delineate like as a kid and as an adult.
Sure.
So many things have happened since.
Right.
But there was a lot of work I had to do. Self-love didn't come naturally, especially when you're so tuned into other people and what they're thinking.
Yeah.
That does weigh heavily. So I would say that I was always a social kid. I had a lot of friends. I was friends with the theater people. I just always connected with people, and I had a range of friends. My summer camp friends were 180 from my, New York friends. And I was able to connect with all of them. So it wasn't until I was older that I had to learn boundaries, and it's not my job to fix other people, but I can support them. So it showed up. It's always been there.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And those boundaries, we'll talk a little bit more about, like, the buzzy word of self-care practices and everything. But in terms of that process, what was that like, kind of adjusting in a clinical setting, being that person that was the fixer, for people in your life, for friends, family, all that kind of thing, and then taking that into a clinical setting where, like you said, you can kind of fine tune that superpower and that connection in in a clinical way. But of course, like you said, boundaries are so important to try to establish. Was that a challenge at first?
It still is.
Same. Yeah.
I don't know. Clinicians doesn't have any sessions. Yeah, of course. I think, I do think that coming from the school system and having sort of had to navigate boundaries on a deep level in the education system, I worked in the behavior program, and it's unbelievable the kinds of things that you see in the school system. I mean, if you don't live it, you wouldn't believe the safety issues and the level of dysregulation. And then I'd have to go home to my kids who are the same age. I would say the boundary part became evident. Unfortunately, it took me to have kids to realize I had to take care of myself. That is not what should be. You don't need to have kids to feel this. It just took me long.
Yeah.
But, when I was navigating elementary school aged kids and giving them my all, and then I had to go home with my elementary school aged kids, it's like I had nothing left. So I had a semblance of boundary when I came to Courage to Connect, but I have had to do a lot of learning with regard to, we're not fixers. I totally fall into that sometimes, and I have to check myself. I have to constantly remind myself of the boundary. It's fluid, and sometimes it's not until I'm past it that I realize, I did it again, but you can always pull back.
Right. That's such a good point. And that's I think, when this idea of just always checking in, being open to saying, hey, wait a minute, and that pulling back is something that, I've been learning more and more, which is that it's okay to catch yourself, where you need to kind of pull back, as long as you're allowing yourself those moments to say, I think I may need to step back here for a second.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about COVID, because you worked in the school settings during that time. You also worked, of course, in the private practice settings during that time. what was that like in the school settings? First of all, like literally can you kind of paint me a picture of what that even, because
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I was talking with somebody recently about this, about working in the school settings as a school counselor during the pandemic. And it's kind of mind boggling to me.
Mm. So I had a role that was different. I mean, I was a school psychologist, right?
Mhm.
So, I mean, you didn't know your school psychologist unless you needed to know your school psychologist, was sort of the MO.
Traditionally.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
So I didn't have to stand in a Zoom room with a whole classroom of children, but what I was doing is navigating, the legal aspects, evaluations, confidentiality, time, the time regulations in a new era. Nobody knew what they were doing. And we were throwing patchwork together, and like many other people, at the time I had a kindergartner and a preschooler, so there wasn't much, or maybe, first grader and a preschool. There was in a dual language program. Not only did my first grader need help, but like he didn't even understand the language at that time,
right.
Nor did I.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you're trying to run these meetings,
Mm-hmm.
changing what you're doing based on the new district initiative daily.
And this is those things that were coming from the top, always changing.
Yeah. Use this template now. You have this much time now. Contact this, and, you got somebody's crying in the background, somebody else is hungry. Then they're throwing switch controls at each other's head. But you've got people on screen who don't know how to navigate that, and parents who are hearing hard information for the first time.
Yeah.
Where you can't lean in and look at them and say, it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
Because you didn't know that. And that I stupidly was also finishing a graduate degree at the time. So it was not a pretty time. It was not pretty. And I think, unfortunately, it was a reactive system rather than a proactive system.
Mm-hmm.
And the following year that everybody went back and they're still doing it was basically doing the same job over again because they had to redo everything. And that just further, the problems that are showing up now, they've always been there.
Mm-hmm.
It's just COVID has brought them to the surface.
Right.
You're doing an evaluation for a kid. You've already done the whole evaluation, but because of legalities, now you have to devote time to doing it again when you've got a list of kids who actually really need your help.
And it's interesting to think about having those conversations with the parents that you're mentioning, of wanting to tell them, it's going to be okay, or we have a plan, that even those were challenging conversations and maybe not even accessible conversations during that time. But then you're doing these things again, and it's almost like having to be in a position of like, so it's still going to be, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I know we already did this, but let's do this again. It was exhausting.
Yeah.
We were spinning our wheels reactively. It was a constant reactive response to things.
At Courage to Connect, how would you describe your current caseload, the kind of patients that you see?
So it's interesting because having come from the school system, I am used to dealing with a ton of people. I think my bar on caseload. So I do have a full caseload.
Mm-hmm.
And my strength is working with kids.
Mm-hmm.
I have a lot of experience with, ADHD, autism, anxiety, and connecting with parents and helping them support kids, their children. I did start also doing work with adults, a lot of parent coaching, but then it sort of morphed into other areas of trauma and, other mental illnesses. And I found I loved it. It was very similar to the conversations I would have with teachers,
Interesting. The conversation with parents in those settings was similar to that of teachers, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Or adults, even if it wasn't parent coaching, as a support person, I always thought of us in the school system as like, like a stagehand.
Mm-hmm.
The teachers were the actors. They were the main show. They were on the field doing the grunt work. And behind the scenes, you had the school psychologist or the social worker,
right,
sort of helping change the scenery. A lot of work.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of that was therapy for teachers after a day where they feel defeated, or let's try this solution, or I'll help you out. You're working it felt like war. Nobody had enough time.
Mm-hmm.
And, you've got this kid running and this kid throwing things and somebody's sobbing here, and it is. It's triage.
Yeah.
It requires a lot of check-ins.
Yeah. And that's probably going home very frequently, knowing that there's so much that literally, was completely out of your control to be able, but you have to go home knowing there's a lot that's not just unresolved, but even untouched, basically, in terms of some of those things. So at Courage, you said you're kind of, you specialize working with children, but also with parents. And so something I'm curious about is this in itself could be a series of podcasts, but this idea of the classic situation of the parents wanting their child to go to counseling, the child not wanting to, the parents putting this in quotes, but like making them. So I'm just curious, like your perspective on this, how often you see this, how I guess normal that is to see. And I guess the greater question of it is how you navigate those situations.
I'm trying to think if there's anybody. I can't think of too many people on my caseload where I see the child. Actually, I don't think I have any. And there isn't a large degree of that the parents share need supporting. That didn't make sense. But, what I've started to learn as I continue to do this is you can't work with a kid who doesn't want to be worked with. Period. Can't do it. Parents sometimes feel like you do it. You know what you're doing, but it's not for me to do. You can't go to somebody once a week and have them teach your kid a skill and then they don't do it. And then they come back the next week and they have to practice it. You have to do it too.
Right.
And usually, it takes me a little while to figure out how resistant somebody might be. Sometimes you work with a kid and you find out that the parents aren't open to changing, not often. And this place becomes a safe space for them for 1 hour. And that's valuable.
Totally.
Right. Because it's not just constant learning skills. It is a safe place for 1 hour with that it's all their own. It's exhausting because you're walking a fine line of, we have to teach a skill. This is falling apart at school. The parents want to know what they're working on. And doing the genuine therapy, which is getting them to trust you.
Right.
And want to come back. Which can take a while. I'm not afraid to say to somebody, this isn't going anywhere. Sometimes people don't want to hear it. That's actually the hardest part is you can be as clear as you want, but people only hear it if they don't know what else to do, which is why I focus a lot on parent coaching.
Yeah. It seems like that's just such a critical part of it because so often, I don't want to say so often, but certainly sometimes parents we talk about the idea of the fixer, parents will send children to therapy with the idea that it's a fix-it situation, right? Here's, from their perspective, here's my child's challenges, here's their issues, here's their behaviors, figure it out. Right. And then from our perspective, it's really not how this works. but to what you're talking about with that parent coaching, even having parents being able to effectively communicate that to parents of saying, that's not really what this is, but there's a lot that can happen in this space.
Exactly. Yeah. I have to say that I look at it from like the emotional piece and the behavior piece. Of course, they're interlinked, but you can't access the emotional piece until you know how to manage the behavioral piece. And so often parents, it's just for a lack of information. That's really it. Understanding the big picture, if a parent's like, they were a mess and then you ask questions and you're like, oh, well, this was out of their routine. They were taken in the middle of the day. They missed their favorite lunch period. They have to redo the test. As a therapist, I'm like, yeah.
Right.
No, they're probably really upset.
Yeah.
And it's all in how you validate the response and set the expectation.
Right.
And I think that's something that this generation, myself included, have trouble doing. I'm going to be here to support your child and sort of learn the underlying issues that show up. And then I'm going to try to support the parent to say, can we work on this? Can we work on connecting? How do we shift? How do you put your foot down? How do you sit through the temper tantrum?
Mm-hmm.
It's, look, somebody changes if they want to change. I have worked with the parents, all of us that are parents that are open to change. Tell me what to do. I want to know how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And to be clear, I don't know how to do it with my kids. This is only anybody else's children, for the record. But, sometimes what we see in our children is a reflection of the things that we do.
Mm.
And that's a mirror that's sometimes hard to look at.
Right. It's probably, I never really thought about it like that, but it's probably it could range from unsettling to look at, disturbing to look at, sometimes probably just surprising, but there's a range of those things. And that's another part of that response. When you were talking about the emotional and the behavioral kind of balance there, thinking about how often in sessions I find myself saying, yeah, that sounds about right. Right. And then note both to the children and even when you talk to parents. And this was such an education for me of talking to parents who didn't understand something, or again, when you are able to normalize something or take a situation and say, yeah, that's actually about as expected, all that. And so often to see the kind of weight off their shoulders of and then realizing like all I did was say, like, based on these circumstances, it sounds like that, but that can be such a relief in that moment.
100%. I think for all of us, big picture helps. There are moments where it's important to dive down into a moment and be mindful and present, right? That's when the anxiety shows up. But a lot of time, that's when you want to help get yourself out of your head. But for the other moments, I think it always helps to zoom out, because then it feels less like doom. Like, this is always going to be like this. Life goes in a cycle. Our kids have cycles. We have cycles. Good days, bad days, related to any number of things. And there is an ease. There's some comfort in knowing this too shall pass.
Right.
But I have to learn how to weather the storm.
Mm-hmm.
And weathering the storm is based on behavior, right? That's when you have to set clear expectations for what your family is okay with and what things are hard stops. And you stick to those. But you always validate the feeling. You don't want to get on the roller coaster with your kid. If you're in a fight with your spouse or your partner, if they're screaming, we so often scream and nothing comes from it. It's like the hardest thing in the world to learn how to regulate yourself while somebody else is losing their mind. But that is how you weather the storm. Right.
So often it comes up to where when we talk about emotional regulation for anybody, it seems like a lot of times, and myself included, we'll sort of be in a situation where we'll be talking to people or thinking about our own situations, and we talk about breathing, we talk about check-ins, we talk about all these sorts of things, and it's like, well, when I'm angry or when I'm very anxious or stressed, I'm not thinking about those things, and it's like that's fair. But then we figure out, it's like, well, what can we do, right? What is accessible in those moments? And that's, of course, we can get into a whole conversation about, being able
Part two.
Yeah, exactly. Part two. So in our first conversation, we talked about a little bit about social media. I want to talk a little bit about it today, because since that conversation, I've been thinking more and more about it, not only in the work I've been doing, but just conversations with people and everything. I'm curious your perspective on this. Again, having worked in the schools, still, working with children, working with parents, all that. Social media, this is my opinion, but I don't think that it didn't invent new feelings or new anxieties or stresses or stressors, but it created completely new ways to experience those things. So I guess my question is, when we think about social media overall, I guess the buzzy way to ask this question would be from your perspective, net positive, net negative, or somewhere in between.
Ooh. Ironically, since our last conversation that didn't get aired, I've had a new surgence of social media issues that have shown up in my house personally.
Okay.
So just for the record, I've got an 8 and 10-year-old.
Okay.
second grade and fifth grade, and both boys. So I have, it's complicated. So I'm going to try and simplify it. We struggle in our house with screens. I'm going to separate that from social media just as much as everybody else. It is an ongoing battle. And it is much like social media, a new reality that we have to accept. You know, we can't just not accept it. You know, I mean, we could, but then you're working against the grain and, you know, at the expense of your kids feeling included in things. So you know, social media is dangerous when you put it in the hands of kids who don't understand what it does. It is. And that's not to say that there aren't well-meaning, amazing parents who give access to this because they don't know what else to do.
Right.
Because the truth is you don't want your kids to hurt and you want them to feel included, and they will be excluded. And, you know, everything has a Twitter handle. Every classroom has a hashtag. Everything is about connection. And I think we do the best we can, but we also have to understand that we accept the reality. So we have to teach our kids as young as they are what it looks like for safe social media and unsafe. What does clickbait look like? What do we believe and what don't we believe? It's an ongoing conversation. I do think that it's really individual. It's really dependent on everybody's family. You know, there are people whose whole world is online, and of course their children are going to have social media. It's not just bad or good. It is how you embrace it in your house.
Right.
Let's make it something that we all understand together, because if we restrict it, our kids are going to find a way to do it anyway.
Just like behaviors of all kinds for the history of time.
The more we say no, the more they say yes.
Now, that's actually the thing that I was having conversations about this with somebody recently, and I guess I hadn't even considered the fact that the idea of restricting screens or restricting social media, like I think it's for a period of time, maybe the last decade or 50, I don't know, that people thought could possibly happen of, oh, my kid's not going to be on. The part I had never really considered, and you alluded to this before, is that, okay, so they're going to go to school or they're going to be hanging out with their friends and their friends are going to be on it. So then the thing that you want them to avoid being on social media, potentially feeling isolated or excluded, is going to ultimately happen anyway. So to your point, we accept that it's really a part of it's the new reality. So then we can start from that basis and say, how, like you say, how can we show what's the ways that it can be, you know, the productive ways or the healthy ways or the whatever, the good ways, and then the you know, more challenging things that we have to navigate, like the bad side of it, which is definitely there too. But I think that, and I remember this from our first conversation, this idea of, you know, parents can do whatever they want. I'm not a parent yet. And as I joked with somebody recently, anything that I think I'm going to do with kids one day, I feel like I got to throw that throw it out the window. But I think that this idea of trying to restrict it is just unrealistic.
Yeah. You know, I struggle with this every day. You know, we're a working household, you know, and there are days where this is I don't have the energy to plan an activity.
Sure.
You know, like kudos to my husband who has all the energy in the world when he's home from work to take them on organic trips to the field museum. And that's great for somebody. That's not me. That's too many people, you know, and there are days where, you know, the guilt plays in where you're like, they've sat in front of a screen for 4 hours, 4 screens, you know, an iPad, an Xbox, a Switch, and they just rotate between it. And how much of that feels like I should be doing something differently rather than this is what I need right now to best support my kids. I need a break.
Yeah.
I need 4 hours of silence.
That's such a good point. And I think that happens with even how often do we hear people talk about things like describing, and this can get into other things too, but like different behaviors, whether it's going on social media, watching TV, playing video games, as not being productive. Now, we can get into like clinically, we get another conversation about that, but ultimately it's always interesting to understand wait a minute, what happens when you're playing video games? What happens when you're watching? That's when we label something as not productive, then we're then saying that, well, if screen time can absolutely be productive, right? Video games can absolutely be productive. These things this idea that we constantly have, like, what is productivity? Is that always working on homework? Is that always doing work? And then it becomes, that's the only way that we can feel productive. But what about rest? What about recharging?
Connection. Right. I have a big issue with productivity because I think it's a term created by our society today.
I agree. Yeah.
As is the word lazy. Only created by this society. And, one of the things I've learned is I was diagnosed in my 20s with ADHD. And anybody who meets me would be like, why did it take that long to figure it out? But in that knowledge, I've learned a tremendous amount about the words that were thrown at me as not productive, lazy, not trying hard enough, forgetful, stupid, those kinds of things, right? Which, if you dissect them, those words don't really mean anything.
Right.
If you are, quote unquote, not doing anything in a moment that you should be doing stuff, well, that's kind of task paralysis. You're overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. You don't know how to start. And your body just needs to, maybe what you need is somebody to help isolate a task for you and say, just stand up. Mm-hmm. When you're procrastinating, that's actually a tactic for a lot of people.
Right.
Because the dopamine shoots when you're at your last minute, and it kind of lights a fire under your butt. Mm-hmm. And some people work best under that and need that. Right. So I think one of the things that I've learned through a later in life diagnosis, through having kids, is this power of acceptance of what is happening in this moment. And maybe it doesn't feel good, but you know what? It's okay. It's okay because we're doing the best we can. And I can always do better in the next moment because life is resilient. Our kids are resilient. You can screw up so many times. And as long as you go back and you say, look, I have to rethink this and I apologize. That's what you're teaching them, is the ability to forgive themselves.
Right.
And if it's 8 hours of screens, okay, that's what we did today. That's where we were in our life in that moment. I think it's more important to keep an open relationship than die on the sword of all the little things.
And calling those things, today was unproductive, or today was a lazy day, or whatever the case. It's so funny you brought up the word lazy too, because productivity or productive and lazy are two words that I love hearing as a clinician, because I love challenging and understanding, empathic challenge, right? But trying to understand what does that mean? What does productivity mean to you? Or like, when I like hearing the word lazy and saying, I want to know what an individual's experience with that is. And so often, like you're talking about, what somebody will define as lazy is that's something that's been put upon them before. But the thing that they're describing, again, lazy is not really a thing.
Right.
Right.
The reason you're not doing what you're doing.
Right.
Listen to your body.
Productivity is defined mostly by other people about what we're doing. Yeah. Acceptance of the things that we're doing, and then the opportunity to, like, well, if we need to reevaluate, we can reevaluate. But then the shame or the guilt that can happen from those labels ultimately can lead to, that 8 hour screen time day doesn't just stay as that, and then saying, all right, well, maybe tomorrow is different, or maybe next week is different.
Or, okay, so from when they woke up at 7 a.m. and on, spring break, and they just sat there despite being asked to do other things or whatever. And, 7 hours later, you've been able to finish your workday, and then you sit down and you guys have dinner and you laugh and you have a really funny day. And then you go sit down and watch a show together. Well, isn't that productive?
Right.
That's productivity.
Absolutely. And that's the thing is it's, if we're going to use that word, then we can't just use it specific to certain things.
Yeah.
Because you're totally right. There's other, we have to be able to totally understand, what does productivity really mean? Because the idea that like society has defined it, it's like, what, we can get in a whole conversation about capitalism and stuff like that. But ultimately, like, that's often where people are talking about it, of like, what is your output? What is it? And it's like, it's kind of, I don't know.
Yeah.
These are,
Dr. Becky said, I think she's an awesome podcaster that is like parenting guru. You know, when you become a parent, the only thing you have to do is, oh shoot, what'd she say? Oh, come on. I love I built this up and now it's like, I can't remember the line, but it's like, it's basically, get a strong repair game. That's what it is. Just get a strong repair game, because that's basically what you're doing in parenting.
Yeah.
Is trying to repair whatever lesson you accidentally taught without meaning it.
Right.
We want our kids to self-reflect. And own it and learn, and not say, I'm bad because I lost my temper and screamed the F word at my kid.
Yeah.
But that was not the way I should have handled it.
Yeah.
I'm going to work to shift it, and I apologize.
And a lot of times we want our kids to self-reflect without expecting that they know how to do that.
Yeah, yes, totally. I hate the meaningless I'm sorry after you punch somebody in the face. No, go get an ice pack and say, are you okay?
So, Marissa, thank you again so much for joining Courage Speaks. I have a couple more questions for you. We were talking before about this elusive word of self-care in this field, probably in any field too. But what does self-care look like for you? Because of course, this is going to look different for everybody. But when we think about the boundaries that we both and everybody in this field continues to try to set or strengthen or assign to, what does that look like for you, and what's been most effective?
So first of all, exercising, which I was not somebody who exercised my whole life at all, but it was an active thing I want to incorporate. And it has since become a mental health thing, kind of like brushing my teeth. And so that's, like one piece of it, but that's not enough to get me through parenting and working full time. So I say no a lot. I personally have found that if I try to jam everything in a day, I'm going to burn out. And so, and understanding that my partner loves to do that. He could go to a car show at McCormick Place and a friend's barbecue later and then go somewhere. And I only have the capacity to do one of those things. So knowing my limits and saying, I'll go to this, but I can't go to the rest. Or if I do all three of these things today, I need the whole day, or I need 4 hours tomorrow to sit in silence, maybe scroll through TikTok.
Yeah.
On my phone. Don't ask me for anything. And that's been the biggest. It's forgiving myself for the things like snapping and really listening to myself to say, well, the reason I did that was because I went too far. And now it's my job to say no. So I try to actively cut time. I try, not always successful, and take time in a week. Maybe it's a couple hours to not do anything and not beat myself up for the laundry that's all over the loft or the dishes that are in the sink, and just say, nope. It's hard.
Yeah.
Even saying it, I feel like a twang, but I push through it and say, because I need this. And the truth is, every time I do that, I am grateful I did it later that week. Because it does. It helps fill my cup up enough to get me the next couple of days.
Saying no is something that I think everybody has different challenges with. The one for me that was so challenging is particularly social obligations or being asked to do certain things. For my whole life, it's if a friend asks me to do something, I'm going to do it. If family asks me to do something, I'm going to do it. For me, and this is more anecdotal than anything, but it's like when I started practicing, because it is something we have to practice, saying no or saying not this time, or, rain check or whatever the case might be, even sometimes after committing to something and having to say,
totally.
But learning that most 90, and again, anecdotal, 99% of the time, 95% of the time, my fears of this person's not going to like me anymore, or they're not going to, doesn't actually happen.
Exactly.
Maybe someone says, I'm bummed out you can't make it or something. And then they wake up the next morning and
everybody's fine.
And everybody's fine.
Yeah. And I think too, look, there are some things you can't get out of. There's some things you have to do, right? Okay. We're not just saying blow off everything.
Right.
But know that you got to do it this time, but tomorrow you'll treat yourself.
Exactly.
If you're going to say, God, I just want to be doing blank right now. Well, you can do that.
Mm-hmm.
You can build that in, whatever it is, a bath, a walk with whatever. You just have to manage your expectations and know yourself.
Right. Well, it's great. It's great words of wisdom. It's great advice. The last thing I'm going to ask you, as we have a couple of minutes here left, is I'm actually curious about, this is kind of a question that's, I think I would like to be addressed toward people that are in the field of mental health counseling, particularly in graduate programs or in training programs right now. This is kind of the classic question of, what's something that you wish you knew then that you know, what's something you know now that you wish you knew then? And again, to be clear, anybody that's listening to this, that's in a graduate program, we all know that no one's going to listen to this, that no one's going to listen to the advice. People can tell all that sort of, but I am curious if there's one person out there that is like, that's actually, what would be something that at that time when you were in training, when you were in school, you would have liked to know that you feel like you have a better idea of now?
Along with self-forgiveness, and even in therapy, I didn't feel like that was a productive session. Well, redefine productivity. But one of the things I learned is you can't do anything if you don't have a connection with somebody. All the laws and the rules and the textbooks, I know how they push it on you, and you have to do it by the book. But the truth is, those things are guidelines. The first thing you need to do is build trust and transparency, and that might take a while, and that might not look like your classic productivity session. You might not be teaching them coping skills, because guess what? Every time you bring out that word, they shut down.
Right.
It's accepting the most important thing is connection first. That's it.
Yeah. With
the parents, with the kid. If you don't have that, you got nothing.
I put it in a way that building rapport in the therapeutic alliance and connection is I like to say it's the only thing that matters until it's not the only thing that matters. And then it's still kind of the only thing that matters.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
You got to get them to want to hear what you have to say.
Even saying, like you say, like if you bring up coping skills in a first session, you'll get eye rolls a lot. Or if you talk about mindfulness, all these things are things that can absolutely, come into play. But as we both know, if that trust isn't there, if that connection isn't there, we want to get to probably a point where somebody hears coping skills.
They're ready to hear it.
And then it's like, I still might not be on board with it, but I do trust this person. So I'm at least open to building out those things.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I think that's really great advice. I will say to anybody that's in counseling programs, social work programs, psychology, anything like that, listen to that one. That's a really important one, because that is one I can pretty much say is not just objectively true.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
Well, Marissa Kaelter, thank you so much for joining Courage Speaks for a second time. But the first for the listeners, we will definitely be having you back. We can do a series of podcasts on probably 8 different things that came up in this one. So.
This is just as fun the second time.
Excellent. Well, thank you for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, and Marissa, for the conversation. Thanks as always to John Marikoski for writing and producing our beautiful theme music. And thank you for tuning into Courage Speaks. We want to remind our listeners that the information and discussions presented in this podcast are intended solely for educational purposes. The content provided is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. It's important to consult with qualified mental health professionals or healthcare providers for personalized guidance regarding your individual situation. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, the field of mental health is complex and ever-evolving. The views and opinions expressed by the host, guests, or participants are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of Courage to Connect Mental Health Center. Once again, thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Courage Speaks. As always, I'm your host, Sam Sherman. Be kind. Talk soon.